everyone. I've got 8 o'clock, so I am going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. I'm sorry, 6 o'clock. I'm
8 o'clock's when I turn into a pumpkin.
I am anticipating a couple of time changes apparently, so bear with me. This is Dave Baker. He runs the Iowa History blog, The 29th State. He does the photography, the research, he authors the blogs, and is currently working on a book, which is super exciting.
It's getting very close to being done, too.
What I've seen on your posts looks amazing. So we're very excited to have him here, and I will let you go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Anna. Yes, the missus is going to be very glad when the book is done, too. So,
one final thing. If everyone would take just a moment and silence your phones, because I know you have beautiful ringtones.
Yeah, actually, I don't know that I silenced mine, so thanks for the reminder. There we go. All right, well, thank you, everybody. As Anna said, my name is Dave Baker, and I've spent the last 15 years now going around Iowa and documenting communities, and not only communities that you see on the map today and places that you drive through when you're going around the county and the state, but I spend a little extra time, and I make sure that we document the forgotten communities and the places that no longer show up on maps. And so when I talk about ghost towns, it's always kind of a fun way to get, it's an interesting opportunity to see people's responses, because sometimes when you think of a ghost town, people think of, a Wild West type village with the old wooden buildings. We don't have a whole lot of those in Iowa because we've got things like derechos and blizzards and farmers that want to make money, and so they plow them under. And so ghost towns are sometimes not real evident. And so one of the things that I like to do is help people understand the importance of these communities, why we would take the time to learn about them, what we can learn from them, and how they might relate to us personally. So if you've been to some of my programs before, you know that sometimes I sort of take a character and I portray a character from a time period. And I thought, you know what, that'd be fun to do tonight, but the story that I'm going to tell tonight is a little bit more personal. And so it actually worked better for me to be in the character of me tonight. And you'll see why here in a little while, because Mahaska County it's a very important place to me. And the communities of Mahaska County are very important, and we'll talk about that here in a little while. Now, it is October, and so because of that, the topic of ghost towns often brings up the conversation of, well, just how often do you see ghosts in ghost towns? Well, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've yet to see one. I'm skeptical that ghosts exist. I've got a friend of mine that tells me you just don't see them because they find you boring. We'll let you be the judge of that tonight. I'm going to start with a little piece here from a wonderful book that I like, and this is not a book that I wrote. Harry Skrdla is an architect and an essayist. And I work in higher ed, and I can tell you right now, you don't find a whole lot of architects who are essayists, probably for good reason. But he's got that rare talent. And he's talking about this in this book, Ghostly Ruins, about abandoned buildings. But really, we can extrapolate it to whole communities. And he says, thankfully, it is not for us to decide if ghosts are real. A lack of evidence has kept skeptics and believers battling it out for some time. And this will no doubt continue well into the future. Rather, it is for us as individuals to decide how we feel about these buildings and their ghosts. The line between ghosts of our imaginings and ghosts of real haunts is perilously thin. Psychology and parapsychology may have to hold hands as they venture into that old dark house together. For a person who scoffs in the daylight might have serious second thoughts about venturing into a ruined building at midnight. We are, after all, descended from primitives, and somewhere within retain those fears. And we must occasionally let those fears crawl out and stretch their many legs. Remember, not all the monsters that our ancestors saw in the dark were imaginary. So in the end, it's up for us to decide, is that dark shape in the corner only a pile of debris, or is it something else? You see, it doesn't matter if ghosts are a real phenomenon, scientifically proven, not for our purposes, because they exist inside our skulls, and that is what counts. And so to some extent, these communities, when we talk about them, are literal ghosts. They do exist in our skulls, or at least in some of our skulls, maybe just in mine, but by the end of the night, I think they'll exist in some of yours as well. So as we look over these places and we think about what they were, I want you to sort of try to envision the people who lived in these places and what they might have thought and what they might have felt. And we're going to look at a number of different communities tonight. But before we get into that here, I'm actually going to start us off at a place called Stone Ridge Mill. And Stone Ridge Mill was only a community in the very loosest sense of the word. It had a post office, and it had a mill, and it had a cluster of houses beginning about 1870. The mill was built in 1871 on the North Skunk River, and it was originally called Wilmer's Mill. Now, the primary commodity from the mill was corn. It was a corn mill, and there was a sheller in the basement, and they did grinding on the first floor. And over the years, it was sold to a number of people. Now, if we look here at this map, here's where the mill would be right here on the North Skunk River. And the post office was short-lived there. It was only about 16 months. After that period of time, the mill was diverted to Rose Hill. But one of the people that used that post office for a very short period of time was a man whose name was Drake. And Mr. Drake's property is right up here on our map. Now, Mr. Drake, Henry Hanson Drake, was arguably the most eccentric guy in the entire neighborhood. And under rather mysterious circumstances, Drake met his demise. Now, you can go visit him. He's over at Wymore Cemetery if you want to go hang out with him. The jury is out whether or not he'll appreciate it because he didn't particularly like hanging out with people when he was alive. But the Oskaloosa Herald perhaps summed it up best when they reported on his death, and they said that Mr. Drake was a lonely, miserly, and unsocial being whose society was shunned on account of his uncleanliness and his uncouth habits. It is thought that he was crazed by his loneliness and committed the act of suicide while demented. He left no note or will. He had about $20 in cash on his person, and several $100s worth of notes were found among his effects. Well, as it turns out, he had a lot more than just several $100s worth of notes, because he was very, very wealthy. He just didn't show it. Well, so the rumors came about that maybe Mr. Drake was not a victim of suicide, but perhaps he was the victim of foul play. The problem is when you're a hermit, as the paper described him in another source, you don't tend to have a whole lot of people clamoring to have the death investigated. And so Mr. Drake's demise was in short order wrapped up. Except for this 1902 newspaper article that appeared in the Oskaloosa Herald. Ghost of H.H. Drake. The residents in the vicinity of Stone Ridge Mill on North Skunk River are considerably disturbed over what is reported to be the ghost of Old Man Drake. Remember, this is 1902. It will be remembered that a hermit named Drake committed suicide at his shack at a place near here some time ago. Strange noises not to be accounted for have been heard in the barn and at the house. Lights are said to have been seen at unseemly hours of the night, and noises heard that sounded like the falling of heavy bodies. Groans have seemed to come from the place. No one can tell just where. The whole site is filled with strange rustlings and drafts of the air as created by the quick passing of some large and unknown object. Well, the newspaper goes on to detail the demise of Mr. Drake and explain how there's speculation of his murder. And it goes on to say that the good people of the community of Stone Ridge, they avoided his farmstead. And they avoided the small earthen house that he lived in because they were legitimately convinced that it was haunted. Now, after 1902, we don't see a whole lot of reports of Mr. Drake, and so we don't really know whether or not there was a murder, and we don't really know whether or not it was true he haunted it, but it's a fun story to tell, and it's a good story for this time of year. But at the end of the day, what I want you to focus on is not the idea of Mr. Drake being murdered, unfortunately, or whether or not he was haunting it, but that he was a real person that had, I said that if John started moving his head, I was going to be in trouble.
I hate to ruin your story.
What'd you find?
I took that article out to the Herald and I told them this is the best ghost story you're going to have.
Yeah?
Well, a few weeks later, a neighbor wrote in and said that was totally made up.
Well, I'm sure it was. Remember, though, the psychology and parapsychology have to walk in that dark building together.
The best ghost story I've ever seen.
It is a great ghost story on there. It is from 1902, which makes it even more fun. It also proves that they were full of baloney back in the press even back then. See, I knew John would have an answer for something here tonight. If that's the only thing you call me out on, I'm going to be in good shape, though. Ken's back there all ticked off. You spoiled his fun. He was hoping for a good. He was hoping to go out there and do some capturing himself and have a big newspaper story. So that's all good. Well, here's the thing: Stone Ridge Mill is a short distance from a small town, which, for all intents and purposes, has become a ghost town itself, and that is the community of Indianapolis. Now, Indianapolis. Who's heard of Indianapolis? Okay, I figured most everybody probably have because it's still somewhat there, right? I mean, they got a cemetery. Indianapolis at one point in time, though, had 200-some residents. It was a very substantial community. It was never incorporated, though, so it was never its own city in the literal sense of what makes a city in the state of Iowa. But it had a number of businesses. Those ranged from a broom factory all the way up to a coal mine that employed a number of individuals. There were drugstores, 2 dry goods stores, and there was a hotel, which in some cases people rather humorously referred to as the Waldorf Astoria. Indianapolis itself, if you're not familiar with it, it would be over almost to the Keokuk County line. It's over on the eastern part of the county. And in addition to the businesses, it had 3 churches. There was a Baptist church, a Methodist church, and a Christian church. They had a literary society. They had their own school. They even had a baseball team. So Indianapolis was a very substantial community at one point in time. Little of the community remains today, though. If you were to go out there, the Christian church is gone. It closed in 1977. The businesses closed up long before that. The last of them, in 1901, was one of the stores. And the baseball team played its last game in 1935. Well, why is that? Why would a community of 200 people dry up to nothing? Well, if you go around the state today, you'll see that that phenomenon still exists. There are a number of communities that are starting to fade away in places. In the case of Indianapolis, failed to get a railroad. In the 1870s and 1880s, the railroad was the lifeblood in the state of Iowa and in most of the surrounding states. The community didn't get a railroad. It wasn't automatically a death sentence, but in most cases it was. There are very few towns that did not get railroads that managed to survive into the middle of the 20th century. There was a railroad that was proposed, but there were funding issues, and because of that, it failed to materialize. Now, the town of Indianapolis itself came about because people needed services. And the railroad would provide services in the 1870s and 1880s and afterwards. But in the 1840s, and primarily 1850s, services were really few and far between in Mahaska County. And those services ranged from everything from getting basic food to being able to get materials to build homes and cabins. And so these small communities like Indianapolis really served the purpose to bring people together. Now, the town of Indianapolis was founded by a gentleman whose name was Willis Baker. No relation to me, as far as I know. But he moved here in 1844. And he laid out the community on some land that his father owned. And it was very primitive. When they surveyed it, they used a literal cornerstone to mark off the beginning of the town. People quickly gravitated towards that neighborhood because as more and more people came in there, they were able to share their skills and their talents and their abilities. So people, when they came into Mahaska County, that was often one of the first places they came to. If they weren't coming all the way to Oskaloosa, that was a good place for them to stop. And there was land available, and because they platted the lots, they were able to sell the land. And bakers were able to make some money off of it as well. There is some evidence to suggest that there was underground railroad activity in Indianapolis. It's very hard to prove that because you have to remember people that were participating and that were breaking federal law. Many of them weren't too eager to write it down. A lot of them wrote it down later and maybe embellished a little bit on there. So it gets very hard to tell on that. However, the community of Indianapolis was well connected to the Civil War. During the Civil War, the men from Indianapolis who enlisted, they were actually assigned to 3 different companies. The 15th Iowa Infantry in particular saw a lot of action. And they served at Shiloh, Corinth, and Vicksburg, some of the most bloody battles of the early years of the Civil War. So Indianapolis had a direct role in that piece of American history. Now, not everybody in the community was in favor of the Civil War, and this is something that you see when you look at Iowa communities up close during that time period, is there was a rather large contingent of what they called Copperheads. And Copperheads were the Peace Democrats at the time. And so those were the people that were anti-war, but pro-union. And they actually had a convention one time at Indianapolis. Now, one of the things I came across for Indianapolis that I think is particularly interesting is there was a medical case that came out of it that made it all the way up to the Iowa court system. And it was in 1872, the court case was called Smothers versus Hanks. And it concerned the town's blacksmith, a gentleman whose name was Mr. Hensley. And Mr. Hensley was making a cannon. And he was very proud of this cannon. And he invited the people from the community of Indianapolis to come work on this cannon with him. And so he had people come in and they'd pound on it a little bit. So everybody had a role in it. And on Independence Day, 1871, everybody gathered around to watch Hensley fire off the cannon in grand spectacle, which it did the first time, but not the second time. You see, he didn't let it cool down. It wasn't necessarily the cannon's fault, but he forgot basic physics, didn't let it cool down, started packing the ramrod in there with a little bit of black powder, and, well, it was too hot, and it blew up black powder and shattered his arm. Well, he called for the doctor, Dr. Hanks. Dr. Hanks was too busy to come and see him at the time, and Mr. Hensley ended up losing his arm. And I'll spare you the details on it. Let's just say that it involved some of the locals and a butcher knife. We'll leave it at that. So naturally, he was, being the blacksmith, having one arm was a bit of a problem, and he was not very happy with the town doctor or the community doctor, and probably a little bit of shock setting in as well, and so it did go to court. However, I will say that Hensley, for his part, was able to recover, and he did do okay, and other than losing his arm, he appears to have done quite well because he eventually became a Mahaska County sheriff. He won the court case the first time, but it was lost the second time on appeal. Well, Indianapolis today is what I would call a partially extant ghost town. You can still see where the town was. If you drive into the area, you can still see where the community would have roughly been laid out. There's definitely hints of a community there. There's still a few houses. But by and large, the cemetery is the biggest thing to remind people that the community ever existed. Now, we get lucky in the case of Indianapolis because it does still have some semblance of existence. Many places don't have that much, though, and we've already talked a little bit about why with that. But Mauch-Chunk is another one in that same general area. And this was a community that existed, again, much like Indianapolis, to serve the needs of the people who lived in that neighborhood. What's interesting about the way they named this place is they were trying to find a name that they weren't going to get confused with anything else in Iowa. You have to remember that they didn't have a database of post offices at the time. And so we were plagued by places of Jefferson and New Jefferson, and Sharon and New Sharon, and Washington and New Washington. And mail would typically get mixed up. So they ended up picking the name of a town in Pennsylvania that they felt was unique. And the name actually means Bear Mountain, which is somewhat ironic because there aren't either mountains in the area. And while there were probably some prairie bears at the time, they would have been pretty rare. And it's interesting because the name is similar to Mahaska, which later on was used in Mahaska County, but has absolutely no relation to that either. It was an unincorporated neighborhood as well, somewhat similar to Indianapolis, but they didn't have the lots surveyed out. It wasn't a town where people would come and they would move into neighborhoods. It was just sort of more of a farming community, I guess we would call it today. Mail came in 3 times a week from Rose Hill. There was a general store there. People would come in and pick up their mail at the general store, and they would often get their supplies as well. And they also had a blacksmith shop there and a town doctor as well. From what I can tell, the blacksmith and doctor did not have any animosity there. The biggest social outlet for the community, though, was the store itself. And the store, if you know anything about stores in the 1900s, they were often the place where people would sit and they would gossip. And so they would come in, the women would do their trading, they would visit with each other, the guys would often have a smoke, they'd sit around and talk with each other. And the community at least generated enough interest that periodically the Oskaloosa Herald would send a writer out there to eavesdrop. So they could report on what was going on there when they got back to Oskaloosa. So every now and then, if you know what to look for in the Herald, you're going to find some evidence of Mauch-Chunk still existing. And in this particular issue here, there was an article talking about how they were going to go out there and do a cleaning at Wymore Cemetery, which is just located south of the town site. Now, if you were to go out to the actual area, there is nothing to suggest that there was a town there at any point in time. This is roughly the town site here. It would have been the school here on this corner, and there would have been a small cluster of homes over on this side of it here. This is 185th Street. And it's a minimum maintenance road today. This would have been the north road going east and west through the town. The town existed more for convenience than anything else. And when it became equally convenient for people to go to another community like Rose Hill or Oskaloosa, these towns that existed for that purpose just sort of fell by the wayside. Today, this would be a true ghost town. There isn't anything left of it. So just how many ghost towns are there in Mahaska County? Anybody want to venture a guess? 50? You know better than that. We counted more than that. A lot. There's a lot of them. As a matter of fact, so I've been doing this about 15 years now. From my count, Mahaska's got more ghost towns than any other county in the state. If you count up the towns that exist, the towns that sort of exist, the ghost towns, by whatever definition you want to use. Some people say, well, if it had a post office, it was a town. You could argue that one way or another. Mahaska County has north of 90. And I know this is hard to read here, but those are the, best as we can tell, the full list. Now, John Jacobs and John Bansford and I, we sat down at Nelson Pioneer about 3 years ago and tried to hammer out as many of them we could come up with. And this is the list from there. I think we got everybody on there, but they're probably missing one somewhere. It gets even more confusing because some places had more than one name. And sometimes you have places that really were truly different, but they existed in the same space. And so many of these actually come about because of the coal mines. The coal mines brought a lot of temporary settlements. Sometimes they brought very substantial temporary settlements, but they only lasted for a short period of time because when the mines played out, they packed up and they moved elsewhere, and oftentimes that involved moving the buildings as well. So even over in the Indianapolis area, there are several small mining camps, and very little to no evidence remains of those. So Tinkerville would be one of them. Now, there is a cemetery, supposedly, for Tinkerville, and John and I were talking before the program about I need to get out there because I drove all around heck trying to find it and had no luck. He knows exactly where it's at. I should have just called him first. Didn't think that far ahead when I was down here. But Tinkerville was closely associated, actually, with Wet Shear. The same mining company that did its operations over in Wet Shear, this was one of their outfits in Mahaska County. Thompson and Walker was the name of the firm. And Tinkerville was such a short-lived place, it barely even gets mentioned. You only find it in a handful of articles. It doesn't get a whole lot of press coverage. But it was around for a few years, and it had a company store. And again, that was where a lot of the main conversation took place. It's where the main trading took place. Excuse me. Over in the same area, you also have the small camp of Wapalooka. And similar idea to it, it was a very small coal mining town. The one thing that it had going for us is the name was suggested by the famous Mahaska County Congressman John Lacey, who came up with the name Wapalooka. Supposedly it meant land by glad waters. If you go over there and look at the slag heaps in the area, I don't know that there's a whole lot of glad waters over there anymore. But at the time, that was probably the case. There wasn't a whole lot of coal over there to leave slag, though. By 1897, the whole area was dried out. They began moving closer to Wet Shear. If you know anything about the Wet Shear area, a lot of the Thompson and Walker mining firms, they ended up creating some really small towns over in Keokuk County. Vulcan, I believe, being one of them. There was also Frenchtown over there as well. We're going to look at a number of communities that are like this today, and we're going to talk about the people who lived in those places as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus primarily on 3 different maps that we're going to use, and all 3 of these are available through the Library of Congress. They're available online for free. If you do any sort of genealogical research, they are fantastic resources because they show the land ownership. So if I send out if I remember to send out the slide deck at the end, they're hyperlinked in here. I'll also put them on the 29th state page so you can go out there and look for them. But there's the 1871 Warner map, the 1884 Oskaloosa Herald map, and the 1895 Gibbs map. And what's great about them is that you can zoom in on them really close and see the actual landowners. What was that? Well, that's par for the course with me. If anybody knows me, I'm a terrible speller. So that's right. They were terrible spellers in the 19th century, too. Thank you for that. I'll try to get that fixed before I send it out. Okay, so we're going to start with the 1895 map here. So 1895, I know this is hard to see because I couldn't blow it up and show you the whole county. But this is the world that a gentleman named George Washington Fisher was born into. And George Washington Fisher was a gentleman who lived many of his years in Mahaska County. He lived a few other places as well. But he's a very typical coal mining person from this area. Now, in the 1870s and 1880s, immigration was still very loose in the United States. People were able to come over without a whole lot of extra prep work. And so George Washington Fisher's father was a gentleman named Robert Boyd Fisher. Robert Boyd came over from England. And when he came over to the United States, he moved to Mahaska County because he was from an area of England where there was a lot of coal mining. At least that's why we think he moved to this area. And Robert Boyd Fisher went into the most lucrative business he could get his hands on in the little town of Evans, Iowa, and that was the saloon. And so Robert ran the saloon. His son, George Washington Fisher, was born in the back room of the saloon in the town of Evans. Or was it Elida? Or was it Knoxville Junction? Well, depending on what source you're looking at, because he didn't have a birth certificate, he changes the story. Sometimes he's born in Elida, sometimes he's born in Evans, sometimes he's born in Knoxville Junction. Well, they're all three the same place, actually. Right there. So, the town of Evans was began by the Elida Coal Company. It's where its name, the name Elida originally came from. And the Elida Coal Company was an enterprise of the McNeil brothers. Now, if you're familiar with Buxton and Muchkinnick, you'll know that McNeils were heavily involved in those two communities as well. So they had their hands in Evans as well through a business called the American Coal Company. American Coal Company was very lucrative for a number of years. Now, Evans changed its name to honor a gentleman named W.E. Evans, who was a coal miner in the area, or excuse me, a coal owner in the area, and he was probably the ultimate rags to riches story. Evans went from sleeping in straw to an empire that included thousands of acres of coal mines, a rock quarry, a tile factory, a sawmill, and a cattle enterprise, all in about 30 years. It was very impressive during that period of time. And as the Elida Coal Company began to lose prominence, there was a motion to change the town's name to Evans in order to honor him. I don't know that I'd call it much of an honor, though, because Evans was a pretty rough town. George's dad, Robert Boyd Fisher, was eventually fined for running an illegal saloon because he was selling drinks after the prohibition laws went into effect. But that was probably among the more tame vices in the community, because the sheriff was often kept busy with fights and thefts. And there were a lot of fights and thefts in Evans. Not only that, there was also the unrest because of the constant threat of coal miner strikes. And there seemed to be a particular amount of strife in Evans because not everybody was unionized there. And so the town would sort of bring up the non-union people against the union people, and as you can imagine, there was a fair amount of tension over that. In addition to that, there was also some racial tension because there were a number of African Americans that also called Evans home. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that despite the fact that they didn't always get along with each other, and they were somewhat segregated even, a great example is they had a African-American town band and they had a white town band, is when the concert bands went to play, everybody would go out to watch everybody else. They could get along for that then. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because the white people were very complimentary towards the vocalists in the African-American bands, but they wouldn't get along with them at the saloon, unfortunately. Now, in addition to the saloon, Evans had a number of businesses, and it had businesses that we would see in many other communities. Grocery store, opera house, had a theater, a two-story railroad depot. Actually, there were a number of shops and stores there. There was a pool hall, a meat market, a barber shop, and even a dance hall. Today, if you go to Evans, though, you're not going to see a whole lot there. They have a church that's held in an old schoolhouse. This picture was taken about 10 years ago. And I don't know what condition it's in now. I've been to Evans in a while myself. But the town itself really began to lose its traction. First as the coal mines played out, and then as the railroad lost prominence in the 20th century. In addition to there being segregation in the bandstand, there was also segregation after death. And so one of the interesting stories that comes out of Evans is the fact that many of the African Americans there were buried in the Evans Cemetery. And as far as I know, all the graves are unmarked there. I don't know, does Evans have any marked graves?
About
Eight. Okay, not very many though. If you compare that to Butler Cemetery, which is where a lot of the white folks were buried, a lot more stones over at Butler Cemetery. I think Carl Nolan has done some work on this. I need to probably get with him on that and see what he's found about that. If you don't know Carl, he's like the graveyard guru for Mahaska and Marion and part of Polk County. Probably one of Evans's wildest claims, though, is the fact that, of all people, Theodore Roosevelt briefly stopped there at one time. It wasn't planned, though. He didn't do a campaign stop there. As it came out, his presidential train was getting low on fuel, and he was due in Oskaloosa to dedicate the YMCA. And so he briefly stopped in Evans to refuel, or his train stopped in Evans to refuel. Evans, again, similar to Indianapolis, not really a true ghost town. It's an unincorporated community. It's a little bit more substantial than Indianapolis. But the population dwindled drastically during the 20th century. By 1930, the population had already fallen from its peak of 500 residents by about half. So by the time the Great Depression rolled around, the town was already down to about 200 people, 250 people. and it just kept falling from there. Give you a little glimpse of what things would have looked like in Evans at the turn of the century. Now, a short distance from Evans, you're laughing, you know where I'm going with this already. Short distance from Evans was another little town called Fishville. And I just put a quick pull of hands here. How many people have heard of Fishville? No, more than I thought. Okay, that's cool. All right, well, George Washington Fisher, our gentleman that was born in the back of the saloon in Evans, he eventually found himself at Fishville. Why on earth would he find himself at Fishville? Well, because he was born into a coal mining community, and when you're born into a coal mining community, you grow up to be a coal miner. And that's what he ended up becoming. And so George W. Fisher ended up going over to Fishville, and there was a little settlement there kind of on the township line, and then there was a mine over to the west, and that was where he worked when he was young. Fishville itself was never much of a town of substance. We're talking maybe 30 houses, 100, 150 residents at its peak. So not very big by anyone's standards. It did have a boarding house and had a general store, a school, and 2 churches. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about the physical description of Fishville. There wasn't a whole lot written about it, but we do get some glances. And so Oskaloosa Herald ran this in 1898, describing it as a little mining camp on the line of the Rock Island, 2 miles west of Evans. It is situated on the sides of a great rounding hill, which if you go out there, definitely the site is. You can still see the hill. The inhabitants are, for the most part, miners and their families, driving livelihood from the mines. Well, there's a surprise for you. They are generally a hard-working, early-to-bed, early-to-rise class. That's what we know about the people who live there. So if you don't know where Fishville is at, I'll give you a little bit of perspective. So here's Evans, there's Lighton, there's Tassel Ridge, Butler Cemetery is down here, 163. There's Fishville for you. Now, you can't really tell. This here looks like it might be a road, and at one point in time it was. It isn't anymore. So if you're planning to get back to Fishville, you have to put on your walking boots. You might want to put on your muck boots because it gets a little damp back there at times. So here's where the coal mine site would have been. Here's where the town site would have been. The railroad would have gone just here to the east. This is what the area looks like today. Now, I got lucky when I got out there to walk through Fishville because they'd recently surveyed it for some utility work. And so I was able to actually find the pin for the section very easily because they had a flag on it. That's cheating, I know, but it worked in my favor that day. So this is the area where the town of Fishville would have stood because you can see from the map exactly where the town would have been in relation to the corner of the section. And you can kind of make out maybe where there might have been some openings at one point in time, but it's very overgrown. It's nice to be able to have a little perspective on this, though, because it is private property, and so most people wouldn't be able to go back and actually see the town site. There you can see there's where the section line was there. So I did a quick scan of some other newspapers because there just isn't a whole lot in the Oskaloosa Herald about Fishville, and it's unfortunate. So I went out and found, let's see if I can find some other places around Iowa, and would you know it, I found an article from the Audubon Republican over in Audubon. Don't know why we're talking about Fishville and Audubon, but apparently there was a big controversy there when there was a mining camp tragedy. So if you read the article, it says, Nye Nelson, colored, they had to specify that, shot and instantly killed Harry Brooks, also colored, specified that as well, at Fishville, a mining camp 7 miles northwest of Oskaloosa. The trouble occurred at a dance. Nelson was caught by some of Brooks's friends and disarmed. He got away but was caught in a cornfield near Lighton. The sheriff had hard work to keep a crowd from killing him. Nelson served 2 years in the penitentiary for shooting at H.M. Krause, conductor on the Rock Island Road. He is a hard citizen and said to a reporter he supposed this would mean a life job. Harry Brooks, formerly of Excelsior and Carbondale, was a minor widower. His wife, Miss Marshall, divorced from Tom Connors, had died not long ago. He has no children. And so this was actually big enough news that it showed up in a couple different newspapers around the state. Audubon being one of them. A little bit more lighter note was this particular one that I did find in the Oskaloosa Herald from 1899. Clay Larkins, who narrowly escaped death after he decided to sleep on the railroad tracks. People who don't learn from history create, the story. They make the same mistake over again, so don't fall asleep on the train tracks. And of course, in addition to Mr. Robert Boyd Fisher having his illegal saloon, he wasn't the only one to have contraband booze at Fishville. Or I guess his was at Evans, but Fishville had its contraband booze as well. And so here's an example, this also in the Oskaloosa Herald 1902, where they confiscated a bunch of liquor there at Fishville. Okay, so the early part of the 20th century, Fishville and Evans, that was the world that this kid was born into. So this is Albert Abe Fisher. He was born in 1917. He was actually born in Des Moines, but he grew up in Mahaska County. His dad was George Washington Fisher. His grandfather was Robert Boyd Fisher. Okay, so we got a little bit of a through line here. Now, he grew up in Mahaska County. He went to East Weaver School. Anybody know where East Weaver School is? I knew you would. Okay, East Weaver School is over by Light. It's not very far from Evans, actually. And as he grew up in Mahaska County, he went through the school system here. Now, he came of age about the time of the Great Depression. He had to go to work. Now, there were still coal mines in the area, but they were getting fewer and far between. So getting to a coal mine meant that he had to do some traveling. And so he would, depending on the conditions, sometimes he'd be able to catch a ride up to near Pella, where the mine was that he was working. Sometimes he would have to hitchhike. But one of the things that Albert would talk about growing up was that he passed by an old house that was quite elaborate. And I think you'll know which house I'm talking about here in a minute. But the house itself was not part of a ghost town. It was not part of a ghost town at all, but it was very near to a ghost town that existed before it was built. That was the community of Laredo. Laredo would have been located near Lighton on 163. If you know where the halfway station is, that gets you pretty close to where the town of Laredo would have been. Now, much of the town's plat has been obscured by 163. It's basically on top of the town site there. But it was a neat little 4-block plat. It was laid out in 1857, and it was a stopover on the state road, because what's now 163, that pretty closely follows what the first major road was that came up through southern Iowa. Now, this is the house that Abe remembered, Voorhees house, and it's taken on a little bit of lore of its own. No, it was not on the Underground Railroad. We're just going to smash that story right now. Sorry to disappoint you. It was not built until 1871. Underground Railroad was already gone by then. But this house also gets you in close proximity to where the town would have been. Now, Laredo did have its own landmark that stood for a long time. It stood on what they called the Pella Road, and the landmark was called the Union Meeting House. And as you can imagine, the meeting house was a church. And it was built about the same time as the Civil War, and all denominations had their services at the Union Meeting House. Didn't matter whether you're Presbyterian or Methodist or Lutheran, they all would meet there. Or Reformed, of course. We're talking about Pella. They'd be Reformed down here, right? And that's exactly what happened in the Union Meeting House. In 1896, it was purchased by the Ebenezer Reformed Church, and they moved it into Lighton. And there was a big lawsuit over that as well, because there were people that did not want that church moved. As you can imagine, concerned citizens with a grassroots movement to save an old building. Sometimes that gets a lot of coverage. They ended up moving it anyway, and so with the building being gone, that was the end of the plat of Laredo. That was vacated in 1896. I'm going to skip over this for just the sake of time here real quick, so I'll make sure we get to everything. So, our friend Albert gets married. He marries a lady named Mary Fisher. They meet in or the lady named Mary Meister. Fisher became her married name. Mary Meister lived in Des Moines as well, but her dad was also a coal miner from Mahaska County. If we go back into his line, so this would have been Abe's father-in-law, we find a number of ghost towns that he and his family lived in. So, Charles and Loretta Meister lived in Harrison Township. And Harrison Township is home to several ghost towns, the 3 in particular that I want to draw your attention to today. So, PK was where his wife Loretta was born. Grew up in, well, actually she was born in Beacon, but she grew up in PK. And PK was owned by the White Breast Coal Company. White Breast Coal Company was a major coal player in southern Iowa. A lot of their work was down in Lucas County. So if you go down the town of Lucas, down around Old Cleveland, that's the White Breast Coal Company. And John Lewis, who was the famous labor leader, the mining firms, he was heavily associated with the White Breast Coal Company. That's where he got his start from. Work began in 1892 at PK. The shaft was 80 feet deep, and they had about 500 acres of coal 6 to 8 feet deep to work with. And they were able to produce a lot of coal from PK. As PK was producing about 1,000 tons of coal per day. It was on the Iowa Central Railroad. The railroad was able to take the coal and use it, and so it was very good for the railroad as well. They had about 300 miners there at its peak, including the Meister family. Now, the Meisters fortunately were not there on November 8, 1892, when disaster managed to visit the PK mine. There was a dust explosion when powder ignited at PK in November 8, 1892, and 3 people were killed. They got lucky, though, because only 3 people were killed. There would have been a lot more people killed if there wasn't something else going on the night of November 8, 1892. Does anybody know what was going on November 8, 1892? The presidential election. And the miners were let out of the mine early so they could go vote. And so only 3 of them were in the mine, and they were the ones that did not survive the explosion. Now, they couldn't vote at PK. They didn't have a polling place there, so they had to go all the way up to Metchakinik to vote. So that was quite a haul to get up there. So that explains even more so why they weren't there. There were also 4 others that would have been killed on the site, but they were tending to the mules at the time. So thank goodness for the animals. Here's what PK would have looked like roughly. This is from a University of Iowa image that they've got available through public domain. Today, PK, not much to suggest there was ever a town there. Lost Creek, sort of the same situation. It was a short distance to the south of there, another place where the Meister family lived. And one of the names I came across that's associated with Lost Creek is a mining, when we were talking about this, as a Monkey's Nest coal mine, which just shows you some of the creativity that some of these people had back in the old days. But Lost Creek itself was property of the Lost Creek Coal Company, which was a short-lived coal outfit beginning in the late 1890s. And Lost Creek itself really consisted of about 25 families. It was unplatted, so the homes were just kind of scattered all over the place. There was no survey, there was no real organization to the town itself. But the Lost Creek Town Company, or the Lost Creek Coal Company, they owned the town. And so they rented out the houses, and they made the houses available to the miners. And so they were able to come in there and take advantage of the housing in there, and it was all done through the company. The problem with that is the Lost Creek Coal Company went bankrupt in 1896. And things looked really, really bad for the people who worked there because they were looking to lose their homes, they were looking to lose their business. Unfortunately, it was a gentleman named Spencer, and he bought the company and restructured it at a sheriff's auction. He was the only bidder. They got it for a bargain. And so the people were able to stay in their houses, and that, of course, that was to their benefit. But Lost Creek, unfortunately, had a little bit of misfortune as well. And good came out of this one, though, in the end. Unfortunately, people passed away because of it. But what happened at Lost Creek was there was an explosion there as well. And the explosion, unlike over at PK, was done because of some questionable practices. And one of the things that they did was they would use black powder in the mines to loosen the coal. And they would use it to essentially blow holes in it. And so they would use that to loosen and be able to get the coal easier. Well, what happened at Lost Creek was they actually had an explosion there. It was caused by what they called windy shot. And so what happened was there was a giant fireball in the mine, and it ended up killing about 22 people in the mines. Several of the ones who were not burned suffocated because of the gases down there. And while this is very unfortunate, what this did was it actually helped aid in the passage of one of Iowa's first labor laws. And so one of the earliest workplace safety laws that we have, and actually I think it is the earliest workplace safety law that we have in Iowa, came about because of the coal mine explosion at Lost Creek. And again, this was widely reported all around the state of Iowa. If you go into newspapers from that era, or that time period, all around the state, you're going to see articles about this. It was a big, big deal in the state. So there's three different ones here. The one on the far end is from Ottumwa. The one in the middle is from Cresco, clear up on the Iowa-Minnesota border. The other one over here is from Council Bluffs. So all over the state, this was reported on. Lost Creek unusually had a rather high number of Eastern Europeans, which is kind of interesting. A lot of the people that mined in Mahaska County, there were, of course, a lot of African Americans because they brought some of them in to scab over in Metchakinik. There were also a lot of Germans. There were a lot of Welsh as well, in English. But Lost Creek ended up getting a lot of Eastern Europeans. And eventually, those Eastern Europeans worked their way into other places of the state. And so what's interesting is as the Eastern Europeans moved farther north, you see a lot of the same names show up in places like Madrid and even Ankeny, because there were coal mines there as well. And so some of these people had ties to this area. Now, I talked a little bit about the African Americans that they brought in here, and Metchakinik was one of the places where that was a very heavy population. For sake of time, again, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details on this. You can pick up Leanne Summers Dickey's book and read all about it. She has a better job probably telling the story than I do here. What you need to know about Metchakinik, though, is that it was the precursor to the community of Buxton. And Buxton, of course, is one of the most substantial mining communities in the state of Iowa. It not only has its own lore, but Buxton itself tells the story of lots and lots of different people. And so if you really want to understand the people who lived in the communities that were down here, you can find a lot of great resources on Buxton because it is so well researched. And Dorothy Schweider did a bunch of interviews through Iowa State. There's a lot of oral interviews available about Buxton. And it really is able to put the perspectives of these people in context. Metchakinik, out here on the side of 163. This is all you're going to find of it. And one of the interesting pieces about this, though, is that they actually did incorporate a small bit of Michiganic. They called it Baxter. Anybody want to know what the reason was for that? Yep, they could have their booze there. Short distance up at the corner of the township, corner of Harrison Township, was the small community of Excelsior. Excelsior, located south of Oskaloosa, was another place that the Meister family lived and mined. What I like about Excelsior is if you go out to the site today, even though there aren't any buildings left of it, you can still see some of the slag heap that's out there. So that's particularly interesting if you want to see what some of these places look like, the scars that are still there. The Excelsior Coal Company had a lot of land that they owned in Mahaska County. They were a very big outfit, and the site of Excelsior itself was quite substantial. They had a Methodist church there. They had stagecoaches that ran from Oskaloosa, and they had at one point in time a population of almost 1,000 residents there. Again, it was a very informally designed community. It was not properly laid out in terms of having city blocks. It was sort of just designed sort of as the mining companies would put down houses for the people to live there. You compare that with Buxton, which was also a mining company owned town, but far more organized. Buxton was really well laid out. There was a real sense of community at Buxton. And what I think is interesting about it is you talk about Buxton itself being the proper town, it also had a number of suburbs. Anybody know that? Yeah, Buxton had suburbs. Now, there was Haystown, and there was Gainesford, or Gainesville, and there was Coopertown, or Cooperstown, depending on which source you read. And Cooperstown is interesting for a couple different reasons. So, Mr. Cooper was a pharmacist, and he was a well-trained pharmacist. He was a very, very intelligent man, and he was also a very good businessman. Cooperstown, as far as I've been able to tell, is the only community that's actually been planned and platted by an African American in Iowa. And so he laid out the town on the north side of Buxton, a property he owned there. And he laid it out for a couple reasons. One, it was on the Mahaska County side of things, so he was able to take advantage of Mahaska County laws. Two, it was not owned by the mining company, it's not owned by the coal company, so he could sell his own lots, and people could work in Buxton at the mines, but they could also own their own property. And three, he was able to take advantage of a little bit of a loophole. Now, we've talked a lot about saloons, so if you've gotten the impression that alcohol drives ambition around here, you're probably a little correct. So, because of Iowa prohibition laws, by the time you get to the late 1800s, you're very limited in what alcohol you can sell. But if you're a pharmacist, as Mr. Cooper was, you had a little bit more liberty on that. Well, you could sell whiskey. And he did a pretty good job of marketing that whiskey to people, especially some of those Germans. And when the Meister family we talked about a while ago needed to move out of Excelsior, they headed down to Cooperstown. They were good Germans. And so Cooperstown itself got a little bit of a reputation as well because it was kind of a wild place to hang out. But really, it was a success story in its own right because Cooperstown was a place that really probably wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for the coal mining town. But through a lot of ambition on the part of private ownership, plus a little bit of the industry down there, the town itself was able to thrive for a few years. Now, unfortunately, when the town of Buxton went under, things didn't bode well for Cooperstown as well. All right, so we've talked a little bit about these towns, and we're going to talk about a couple more here in a minute, but I just want to bring things together here real quick because we are getting to the top of the hour, close to the top of the hour. So we talked about the Fisher family, George Washington Fisher and Albert Fisher, Abe Fisher. We talked about Mary Meisters and her family, where they came from. Well, why do we bother talking about people like this? Who cares about this? Well, you may not care about it. That's fine. They eventually moved to Des Moines. We'll talk a little bit about why they might have moved to Des Moines here in a minute and how that relates to ghost towns. But they had a very large family. They had 10 kids, a whole number of grandkids, and they had a few great-grandkids, including that guy right there. You're looking at him. So this is why Mahaska County is important to me, because on two lines of my family, I can go back and I can find birth and death records in these communities. And I can go into census records and I can find these places. I know for a fact I had great-great-grandparents that lived at Excelsior. They lived at Carbonado. My great-great-great-grandfather's death certificate says Fishville on it. He died at Fishville in that same woods that I was walking through back when there used to be houses there. And so it really brings it together and you go, wow, you know what? These people lived a long time ago but they still have a legacy, even if it's not famous, even if it's not something that seems important. And so when we talk about these ghost towns, we remember these people that called them home because they have their stories to tell. Now, a lot of places over the years didn't fall into true ghost town status. They just sort of fell into kind of a limbo area. And time will tell whether or not they completely disappear, or maybe they'll get a renaissance. Bell Fountain is one of those places. At one point in time, Bell Fountain itself was a pretty substantial community. But unlike so many, it was unable to get a railroad. And it came so close to getting a highway with 92 going through there. And maybe if it had gotten a highway going through there, it might have seen a revitalization. Maybe it wouldn't have. We don't really know. What we do know is that people packed up and they moved to Tracy. And why did they do that? Well, that's where the services were. You could go and you could shop in Tracy. You could do business in Tracy. You could trade at Tracy. You could load your commodities on the railroad and ship them all across the country from there. Load your coal, your corn, your cattle. That's what the Fishers did too. They moved around. They moved around a number of communities. They lived in Lytton. They lived in Oskaloosa. They lived in Des Moines. And Des Moines was where the action was, and that's where they stayed the rest of their lives, in the metro area. In so many places, that's exactly the story that goes with the people who lived there. They moved on for other opportunities. And they looked for other things that could make them successful. Another community, in the same sort of the same idea, would be Agricola, or Agricola, depending on how you pronounce it. And that would have been located up in the northern part of the county. And again, at one point in time, it was fairly substantial too. They even had a justice of the peace there. But they didn't get a railroad. The railroad missed them by a mile. Only a mile. And the town would have still been on the map. Well, if you look where it's at today, we have Barn City instead. Because they packed up the town, they moved it closer to the railroad. It became Barn City. The town's still kind of there. Just a little bit farther to the north. So to wrap things up tonight, I'm going to go back to our Ghostly Ruins books here. And let me find the section I want here real quick. Harry Skurdla, again, our architect turned essayist here, he writes about empty buildings. And again, empty buildings we can easily extrapolate into empty communities, or nearly empty communities. And he says, an abandoned building is dead. It's as dead as any corpse lying decaying in a field. But it too once lived, was animate, and in a sense had a soul. Except the soul was us. We gave it life and meaning, motion and warmth. We put the spark of light behind the shade-lidded windows. We put the circulation in its corridors. It consumed supplies, and it produced waste. The thing was alive, but the life force was us. So when you think about these communities, we think about our own communities. Because there's not a whole lot in some cases that separate our own communities from becoming a ghost town. So when we think about our towns, and what I tell people when I talk about the 29th State blog and the 29th State program is, think about what you're contributing to your community. And that doesn't have to be financial. What are you giving back in terms of volunteering, church volunteering, organization volunteering, Lions clubs, PEOs, programs like that? Because so many of those organizations are needing people to take those leadership roles. And there's a lot of people my age that I thought, well, when I first started writing this blog, people my age, I'm an outlier. We don't, there's not that many of us that care about history and these sorts of things. There are. But a lot of them don't know how to get involved, and a lot of them don't know where to turn to on it. And it can get overwhelming. I'm married, I have kids, I get it. But the fact of the matter is when you step out and you start working with people and you get to know them, you build a lot of connections. And when you build connections, people are encouraged to take on opportunities and take on roles. And ultimately, that's what the 29th State is about. It's not about so much the history. It's not as much about the abandoned buildings. It's about making connections. It's about making connections through our shared history. Because history can be a big divider, but it can also be a really big unifier. And so when I talk about these communities, we may not have known each other before I walked into this room. But I'd be willing to bet there's probably at least a couple people I'm related to in here. I got a lot of ties in Mahaska County. And if not, we can go down to Wayne County and find a few more down there. So I got ties all over Southern Iowa. Jasper County, oh yeah, I'm related to Jasper County. I'm related to half of them. So anybody been to Mingo? Yep, that was our family too. We choked off the town of Greencastle when the railroad bypassed it. Yep. Anyway, I digress. So when I talk about these places, it's not about the history. I mean, it is about the history, but ultimately what I want people to realize is that we are all connected, and there's more that connects us than there is that divides us. And that's right now an important thing to remember, not only in our country, but in our world. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the 29th State, it is primarily available on Facebook. It is public facing, so that even if you don't have a Facebook account, you can search, you can read the articles, you can see the pictures. I use Facebook because I am the world's worst web programmer. I attempted to design a website and it looked like garbage, in which I hired Eric Nelson to help with, and then he got busy with stuff, so that all went by the wayside too. So eventually I will have a proper website, but it's not up and running yet. So Facebook is a great way to connect with me. The 29th State is the name of it. And I haven't done a whole lot of posting here recently because I've been busy with the book. It just got through the final editing stage and trying to find all the little commas in the wrong place and all that. So I've got some work to do to get that ready to go, but hopefully January, February is when I'm hoping to have that up and available to everybody. So very excited about that, but that's consumed a lot of time. And then as I was telling John, I told my wife this year, I said, I did 16 programs last year. And this is a side gig, a side hobby that I do in the evenings, and most of my content's written between 4:30 and 6:30 in the morning. So that explains my misspelling there. I hadn't had enough coffee yet. But I told my wife, I said, I did 16 programs last year. That's too many. I can't do 16. There's not enough time in the day for that. I'm going to cut back in 2024, and so I cut all the way back to 19 this year. Actually, I take that back. I cut back to 18 because I had COVID and missed one of them. So, Allerton, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I'll be there next year. Yeah. So anyway, it's been a busy year, but it's been a fun year. So I do travel all around the state, and I do try to cover information from all 99 counties. To date, I believe I've covered 97 of the 99 counties. I gotta get up in those corners. It's just a little bit far to get up there. But a lot of different towns, a lot of different ghost towns, a lot of great stories. Do a lot of work with newspapers. Have a lot of fun with that. And I'm going to be rolling out some new stuff that I'm working with here in the next couple of weeks. I've done some interviews. It's the first time I've really done that. And so I'll be sharing some of the writing and transcripts from some of those and figure out what the people in towns want us to know about their communities. So kind of a fun way to approach it. Real quick before I close here, I do want to say no presentation, no project is good without good sources. I'm heavily reliant on good media and good materials, and incredibly indebted to not only the library here, but the folks who make the newspapers available digitally, especially the ones from the late 19th century. If you look at this closely, you'll see there's a lot of John Jacobs, John Jacobs, John Jacobs, John Jacobs on there. Don't make that face. Only you and I know that, though. Great resource right here. So this is, I nabbed this out of the Iowa State Library. I work professionally for Iowa State. I checked this out in 2015 and keep renewing it. So far, nobody else has put on requests, so I must be the only person that cares about Mahaska County up their names. But History of Mahaska County 1984 is a wonderful, wonderful resource. Many of you have probably seen it, probably more than a few of you have contributed to it. And so, in addition to John, if you've taken part in that, I thank you. That is just, it's a great starting place to find a lot of information. Additionally, as much as I don't want to give the Hawkeyes credit, the University of Iowa does have a phenomenal maps database online. And so if you're interested in seeing more county maps, you can go out to the University of Iowa's websites, and they have a number of atlases digitized and some wonderful resources out there as well. So I thank you very much for this evening. I appreciate your time and everybody coming out. It's a nice crowd. Anna, thank you for inviting me, and my favorite groupie here showing up here, John Bandstra. You've come and listened to me probably more times than anybody else. So Jerry Peck's trying to give you a run for his money, but thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'll stick around here if we have some questions. I'll be happy to answer questions. You can ask me about 29th State or traveling or ghost towns, and I'll give you an answer. And if I don't give you an answer, we'll call on John to give us an answer. And if he doesn't know, then we'll just make something up. So 2 questions. Yes, ma'am.
Where is Gibbon? You had that written down.
Yes, so Gibbon is, let's see if I can bring up a map to show you here. It's going to be to the southwest of Oskaloosa. Let me see here if I can bring it up here real quick without. Yeah, before you get to the city dump, that's probably the best way to describe it there. Okay, so here's Oskaloosa right here. Given is down here. So it's just to the southwest of there. You said you had a second question?
Second question, do you know anything about Granville?
Granville was located north. It's up in this area over here. Let's see here. Or my map's got the resolution's not real good on this particular one here. It's going to be up here closer to like Tanner and Peoria. About a mile west of Tanner. Yeah.
So how big was that at one time?
So offhand, I'm not 100% sure, but let's see here real quick. Another great resource is the Iowa Gazetteer and Business Directory. And let me see if I can pull it up here real quick. Let's see if I can bring it up here real quick and find out here. And we're looking for Granville. The 1914 Iowa Gazetteer and Business Directory, Granville, Mahaska County, C. Tainter. That's what it says. I'm not even feeding you a line there. That's what it says there, C. Tainter. It's also further complicated because there's also Granville up in northern Iowa too. So
I'm gonna guess it's a couple hundred. You read the old papers, there's several businesses there. So if there were several businesses, there had to be a small.
I was gonna say it probably I'd say.
Of course, the river's come through and missed it, and there's Taylor.
Yep, Tainter was what came out of it. It's probably 75 to 100 at its peak, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, in the back there. When am I going to come back and do some more of the county? Well, I got a lot of the county on here. As a matter of fact, I've got probably 700-800 pictures around the county here. I just don't have enough time to talk about all of them. So I can come back and talk about more if you want.
Actually, as we were exchanging information, he said, I had to cut this back substantially because I ran way over time.
Yeah, so the first iteration of this program, so I always run through, make my wife listens. People wonder why my wife doesn't come to the program. She just listens to me ramble at home all the time. The first iteration of this I did came in at 1 hour and 45 minutes. So I had to substantially cut back on that. Actually, it was pretty much perfect tonight, which is good. So like I said, Mahaska County has more ghost towns than any other county. So, I could stand here and just start throwing out names, stuff that I didn't cover, Carbonado and Cricket and Concert and Durfee and Truax and yeah, Phalanx. Phalanx is a great one. That was the utopian community. East Des Moines, yeah, Oak, White Oak, yep. Stark Station, Evelyn Mills, Evelyn Ferry. Yeah, there's a lot of them, whole lot of them. Marion County gives you a run for its money. Marion County has a lot of them too. So does Monroe. A lot of ghost towns in all three of them there. But yeah, great history in some of the places. So if you're interested in more, let's see if they'll bring me back next year. I'll be glad to come back. I love coming down here. Yeah.
A couple questions. What's the name of your book?
Yes, great question. More Than Waypoints is the name of the book. More Than Waypoints. Yep. And so I should give a little bit of disclaimer here. I don't focus on the ghost towns in that one. It's actually the incorporated communities. So in Iowa, communities that incorporate are considered cities, regardless of whether they're the city of Des Moines or they're the city of Beaconsfield with 29 residents, or Leroy with 30 residents. So an incorporated city is one that has its own city council. It's got its own government, not necessarily city council, but it has its own governance. It has its own tax base. And so in Iowa, when I started this in 2009, there were 947 incorporated communities. We're down actually at 942 now. Some people throw on 939, and I don't know where that number comes from, because 942, I believe, is where we're at now. But anyway, so waypoints are what the technical name is for the little spot on a map. And so that's why it's called More Than Waypoints, because it's about the 315 communities of central Iowa. So the first book is Minnesota to Missouri, the center third of the state. So it's Kossuth to Mitchell, Appanoose to Ringgold, and everything in between. So Mahaska County is included in that. Now, I do have people that ask me, well, when are you going to do a ghost town book? I'll probably get around to doing one of those eventually. I gotta get the first one done first. So it'll take me 15 years to get to this point. So, but I got married and had a couple kids in there, and moved 3 or 4 times, and life happens. So things have settled down a little bit. So I was telling him, I said, now my oldest is old enough, I can drag him along with me. And so, unfortunately, it's the youngest one that would probably enjoy this more. He's more of the history buff, but his patience riding in a car is nada. So I can drag him out 2 hours in the middle of nowhere and listen to him for that amount of time. Did you say you had another question?
Yeah, I just wondered if somebody wanted to get started researching their area, where would you suggest they start?
Great question. So if you're interested in researching your area, there's a lot of great free resources out there. So what I would recommend doing, first thing you want to do is figure out kind of your area by township, because a lot of the older maps are going to be based off of township. And also because a lot of not necessarily so much the towns, but a lot of the post offices moved around. They were contingent on who the postmaster was, and so if I was the postmaster here and next one's postmaster over there, I've seen post offices jump county lines and have the same name. So it gets a little bit confusing on that. So I'd start with the township. In Mahaska County, you can go out to the Beacon Assessors page. You can search by map, or you can search by your property parcel, figure out where your township is. And the next thing I would do is I would go out to one of those map sites, the Library of Congress or the University of Iowa, because you can go to the township, find your section. You can get very close in figuring out what was there before. A lot of those maps show schools, they show churches. Sometimes they have names on them, sometimes they don't. It just kind of depends on the map. I've gotten really lucky that I've been able to find where my family was on a number of the maps. With the Meister site, it's a little bit harder because they were coal miners they didn't own. They rented, so they jumped around a lot. But with the Fisher side, they eventually got enough money, they were able to purchase some land near Lighton, and so I know exactly where their property was, and it was very close to East Weaver School, which is where my great-grandfather went to K through 8, and that's, I believe, as far as he went. I don't think he had any high school, so yeah.
Before I forget, Farmersville. Have you ever heard of Farmersville?
Yeah,
Do you know anything on that?
I don't have a whole lot in Farmersville. It would be up here, kind of in this area. I don't think it was much more than a post office and a few houses.
I looked through papers, and again, you don't find anything.
Yeah.
The only thing I found, the post office of Farmersville was discontinued because nobody would take the office. So you get an idea, it was moved around from house to house, and it wasn't really a town.
There's a book that was put out. Alan Patero was one of the writers on it, and he actually went to Washington, D.C. and spent I don't know how many months digging through the actual post office records. And as far as I know, it's the closest guide to Iowa post offices in there. And let me see if I can pull it up here real quick for Mahaska County. I might be able to, because I have the digitized version on here.
While he takes a moment to look this up, I do just want to mention this program is sponsored by the Friends of the Oskaloosa Public Library. If this is the kind of thing that you enjoy bringing to Mahaska County, one thing you could consider is joining our Friends group. It's $10 a year for an individual, $25 for a family, and it helps us bring awesome programs in. It also gets you extended checkouts on any library materials, so just a little plug for us as well. If you like this, consider us. Thank you.
Does it get you check out times like Dave had with that?
Probably not, but you do get 4 weeks on books, which seems like a pretty substantial start on a project.
Okay, I'm doing this blind here because my screen doesn't. So I don't know if you can see this very well here. So this is the digital version of Patero's book on Iowa post offices. So Farmersville right here, 1866 to 1871. At that point, it was moved to Oskaloosa. But it's got a reference here. It was formerly, I'm going to guess it's pronounced Chandler. Chandler, is it pronounced Chandler?
Chandler, just north of,
Yeah.
north of South Scum.
Yeah, so it was Chandler from February of 1866 to April of 1866, and at that point it was changed to Farmersville. So same place, different name. Any other questions?
Well, one remark. I call it junk and debris. I've got an advertising trade card. There's a cemetery, and I can't think of it, south of town. And there's a cemetery there, and I can't think of the name of the cemetery. Anyway,
Carpenter?
Was it a town or what was it? Well, I got an advertising trade card, advertising products, 1880s, 1890s. The key thing on the back side, for sale by so-and-so, and it gave the town name. So evidently he had a country store, but all of a sudden that was a cemetery.
Cologne is down there.
It's like Farmersville. Was
Yeah.
there actually anything there or what? Well, there's an advertising trade card. There's the salesman. There's the businessman there.
But a lot of it's subjective too, because some people say, well, that's not a town. That's just you look at over like by Lake Red Rock. I mean, there's little corner stores and stuff all over the place. Is that its own town? Well, today we wouldn't call it that, but back then, those places were more important. Starts with a P. I was gonna say because Carpenter was one that came to mind when we said south of town there, but he's shaking his head no. So.
Anyway, that was proof that there was a business there. If you wondered what was actually really there.
Yeah, it's.
And I don't know that it had a post office. It's just here's an advertising trade card.
And what's interesting is so many of the places that began as like stagecoach stops, they really weren't more than a house, but the people that lived there, they were able to take advantage of that. Okay, we're going to put a stock of goods in here that you can pick up along the way, and next thing you know, there's a blacksmith and 2 or 3 things, and it's become more substantial. Nobody planned it that way; it just kind of happened. While John's looking that up here, any other questions? I want to hear the answer to this. So. Yeah.
I grew up in Washington County, in a little town of Rubio.
Yeah.
And my parents are buried at Clay.
So I haven't done as much work in Washington County. I've been there. I've been to Rubio. Not a whole lot there, but it's.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
That's when I was a kid. Yeah.
Actually, I have a coworker of mine who's from Wellman, so not too far from there. Clay is just a little bit to the northwest, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
It's right off of 78.
Okay.
And that's pretty old. They had the underground railroad.
I was gonna say, you get further over the east, and you get a lot more of the underground. Lee County, in particular, has a lot of great history on there. Actually, if you're interested in the Underground Railroad, and this kind of surprises people, one of the best places, in my opinion, is Tabor, which is over by Council Bluffs, because they would bring the slaves out of Kansas, and there were not a whole lot of settlements in that part of the state yet, but Tabor was one of them, and it was founded by people from Oberlin College, which was an abolitionist college, and so they intentionally brought people and stuck them out there for that purpose. And so if you go to Tabor, they do have probably better records because they were well aware they were breaking the law and they were proud of it. And who was going to go clear out there to catch them, So there's some really cool stuff out in Tabor. And the town of Tabor got a major grant for their library. Well, it was a grant and a private donation both. And they have a beautiful state-of-the-art library. It's a town of like 500 people, and they've got this great research room, and there's some neat stuff there. So yeah. Yes. The Todd House is there, and then if you're traveling through that part of the state at the right time, you can go up to Lewis and go through the house that's up there as well. That's another neat one. All right. Oh yes.
Are there Methodist church records for the church in Excelsior?
Not to my knowledge. I've never seen them. Is anybody here with Keoma genealogicals? Is it even much of a thing anymore? I guess I didn't know if it was or not. Kind of. They may have some records here. I've never seen ones for Excelsior though. He's got a great repository.